I know Chris is having a little bit of issues with his mic. So Chris, are you available to do the introduction?
Hey, Karen. Yes, I am. Just had to unmute the double mute. Oh, the dreaded double mute. So thank you, Karen. And good afternoon and welcome back to B-Sides Tampa 2021 and our second Talking Cloud track. We sincerely appreciate your support and attendance in making this online conference a success. In partnership with the Cloud Security Alliance Tampa Bay Chapter.
It looks like he is having some technical issues. So I'll go ahead and do the introduction. So really, give me just a second. So Brent Keator, he works at Nielsen IQ, and he is part of our cloud security, our cloud operations team, and he is focused on protecting our cloud environments, along with identity, making sure we have proper guardrails across all of the different cloud providers that we support. Brent is a key contributor and leader in this space, and definitely looking forward to his presentation as part of our CSA Tampa Bay Chapter in partnership with the B-Sides group. We have put together this cloud track, and this presentation is Don't Fall Asleep at the Wheel. So Brent, let me hand it off to you.
Thanks, Karen. I'm assuming you guys can hear me. My focus is really on cloud, where I am at Nielsen. So I run, like Karen saying, around the cloud division. I focus on identity, working on aspects of our portal to support our end user applications, but ultimately support our cloud platform where all of our product production infrastructure coexists. As a company in Nielsen, we have, we recently have kind of split off. I'm on our CPG retailer side of the business, where I used to be on the media side that I came in through an acquisition. From a cloud perspective, I've touched all major, been involved with AWS for years, Azure for the last few years, and I've had experience with GCP, but I've also embraced other clouds around like Packet and other bare metal clouds like Internet. And also, data center. People forget, clouds run in data centers as well. And before this, I spent about 10 years in the fintech arena, and it was, before cloud was really a thing. And so I spent a lot of time in data centers, and, we were just tapping into realizing the potential in cloud. Obviously, there's more guardrails around security and privacy of the data, but we started building out our own separate data centers or colos where we do calculation grids during periodic points of the day, and starting to think of things more in a cloud manner when I was there. The commodity-esque hardware of blade servers to be replaced instead of troubleshooting every issue, and think of everything more transient and immutable infrastructure. My focus here is to kind of make the point that security needs to be embedded into all of the decisions that we make, and it needs to be across different teams as well. The aspects that I think are important are some of the kind of tooling and other areas that I'll talk more about as well. So this, I've kind of given you a little brief rundown. I've been in New York about 20 years, and I've been in the large enterprises, startups, and I've touched many of the kind of clouds. But I do find it very important that security should be in what we do in the day-to-day and basis for all the architectural and support decisions were made, and not just from a side view from a static point in time, more dynamic and a part at the table, table stakes more or less. I talked about why cloud. These are the areas I really kind of want to focus on for this particular presentation. Tooling, what we bring to cloud and what we use there. Just having it doesn't necessarily solve all the problems, and neither does having the automation that might actually be cumbersome or hard to manage. If people leave, it's tough to maintain. So I just want to touch a bit on that. Trust, I think the last presentation and previous ones, we talk about kind of the least privilege methodology, and just when we enter into projects or platforms or clouds, we kind of think of it in that lens to make sure that we're building the RACI accordingly. Architecture, like I'd mentioned, I find that the historical pattern is that a lot of architect teams have maybe a 3 or 4, maybe a 2 out of 10 when they think security, and then they build their platform and then they bring it to security to get approved. And they should be built in the idea security to be involved in as part of a council or a guild, or should be even embedded as these kids are coming out of college. I mean, these are the thought processes on how they're working into more of their self-service and automation, and then how they want to make sure that their environment is trusted, especially as we get more into containers and Kubernetes and shared clusters and then the complexities there. We need to make sure that our security realm evolves in the same direction, and making sure that we're staying lockstep in those directions. I put optics because I think there's, I want to make sure that there's things that are gated processes. I want to make sure that, we understand them and know why they're there. And then maybe there's things that we can do as a community to help improve them. And just general questions that people are faced. We could develop a solution today and things could change, but, security teams have already approved it. You want to make sure, how do we, what's the path to making sure that we feel comfortable when we sleep at night, knowing that our environment is protected. And then cost. I think this weighs into a lot of decisions. I think we look at, business requirements. We can call out a breach concern from a CV, and there's lengthy lead times to getting it resolved. And leadership would probably be more focused in a lot of cases on the client that's complaining the loudest, as opposed to plugging that hole, even though a potential breach would have more of a cost than losing that particular client. So I think being proactive, but understanding the cost, and also thinking from a security perspective in that lens, what does it mean when we think of a 10x perspective? What does it mean whenever we're looking at it from like an egress perspective? And I think egress is a good thing to call out, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. It wouldn't be a presentation without a good Werner Vogel quote. I feel like, I don't know. I miss going to the reInvents, and I think the last one I went to was like 40,000 people. And so I'm hoping we get back to these conferences, although that one's too big. I think KubeCon's probably more, or even the B-Sides, I missed it last year. But I'm hoping to get back into these. I feel like the end user community talking is the biggest asset that kind of comes a lot up from these in the stimulation of ideas. But this, I brought this quote in because obviously Werner Vogel, a big icon in the cloud space, and people listen to what he has to say. But he talks about the top priority of being security, and the businesses shouldn't be on the internet. We need to make sure that what we're planning for and building for, and it's the same thing with the cloud. The cloud is recognizing these providers that they need all these tools to keep it protected. But the thing to call out there is that there is parity between a lot of the cloud providers. There's a lag time. Some of them even use the same names for the services. I've seen things in Ali Cloud that's the same name in AWS, or vice versa. And I think it's just important to call out that they can provide the services, but if we don't leverage them and tune them to what our needs are, it doesn't necessarily make our application secure. And we also need to be involved in the feature roadmap. I've seen examples where people have moved from appliance firewalls that were built more for on-prem, and then moved into cloud and said, hey, there's a firewall service that's being announced. Let's take advantage of this, and we don't have to support these licenses on these cores for these firewalls. And then they embrace it, but there's still things that are potentially gaps that are in a feature roadmap, like IPS and IDS. I think that everybody's it's a quarter ahead when these things are. But just make sure that you can, as somebody that's an influencer or dealing with cloud, you can influence these feature roadmaps. Make votes, make suggestions, make them a part of what makes it the successful security platform, so you can sleep at night. So I try to be proactive in that area, and the same thing around support. But I think that what the point is that cloud providers can offer these services, and they need to, but we need to tune them and make them best use for our platforms. We need to make sure that whatever automation we're using, that we're actually think of it in the lens of how our application operates and the costs that are associated with it. Tooling. Tooling, I sometimes consider myself a tooling guy. I look for the best tool for the job. I think that, my first kind of bullet here is kind of set it, forget it, is not for the faint of heart. And the idea here is that I try to, and I encourage it, to look at what we select for tooling and make sure that we are thinking future with it. I try to stay and make sure that we look at things on an annual basis, whether we sign a a 1 year, 3 year, 5 year contract, I'm looking for the thing that can replace it on an annual basis. I want to, and it's just mainly to keep our solutions honest, help provide feedback for any, you know, the tool that we have. Maybe there's things that they can add and they know that potentially there's other tools that we could jump to. And I think that it's important to know what the industry is saying and what the ecosystem has around those particular tools. The other aspect of kind of the set it, forget it is that, you know, I've seen us bring in, and companies bring in tools and they have that answer whenever somebody asks. Like if you're looking for if you're running a Kubernetes cluster and you want a registry scan solution, and you bring in Aqua or Twistlock, yes, you can scan the registries, and if anybody asks from an RFP or a CSA, or you have it, but are you getting compliance? Are you getting 100% of your audit to success ratio? Do you have the automation to enforce it so people, you know, they're pushing releases, those builds are breaking? So I think that just having the tool doesn't necessarily solve the problems, and I think we know that, but I think that it's really hard to anticipate based on their cost models, what we need day one. So looking for a true up model is super useful, but actually trying to enforce it with automation. And if you can't get a fixed model for your early years as an adopter, try to make sure you budget and accommodate for whatever is coming through where possible. Selecting annually, looking at an annual basis is super important. I've been with tools that I've looked at and for 5 years, and I still have the same one. But at least I know I feel comfortable that this is, you know, the direction that without looking at a quadrant square of what the best one is, this one fits us and this one works. I just want to call, just taking a step back. So I spent some time in the fintech area for 10 years, and then I went to the startup area. And before I got there, I joined an ad tech startup. But before I got there, I would go to a lot of meetup groups and learn about all the different startups that were out. And a lot of times there's, you know, free dinner or drinks, and so there's somewhat of a bonus to it. But you learn about all these different tools, and so I stayed close into that community even now about the different tools and things that are being funded and the VC action that's going on. So I just want to call out a few things in the security realm that I thought were kind of neat. One was that we came across this. It's like essentially an access controls for databases. It's like a database proxy that you could control, you know, where you're managing your users and your lifecycle policies of those users on it. A solution with strong DM, and they've embraced more of SSH and RDP and controlling access there. And I call it out because we were essentially building our own solution. We basically built our own kind of Slack bot where developers needed access to a database that we would have a audit trail for it in a time box and provide them keys, and it would expire, and we'd have, and it worked and it was fine. We'd hit some stability issues as they'd run more queries, but it was a central database that we had high transactional throughput, so you couldn't, and it was massive in size, so we couldn't necessarily maintain our dev and parity, and then, you know, a lot of development needed access to understand if there's issues or different configurations, and so we didn't want to blindly allow them access. The other thing is I see a lot of sprawl on databases. You know, essentially, people, whenever you ask for temporary access, I find that everything in the tech world isn't temporary. You know, even an environment, oh, we only need this for a few months. It's up there 3 years later, and it's used for 3 different purposes. So I think having the controls at a proxy level is interesting, especially we've even seen use of it from an SSH where we'd have large server farms where we need to provide temporary access to help us troubleshoot an issue from the engineering side. And we try to isolate only to our production support to have access to all of our hundreds of web servers. Now, this would allow you to have a full transcript of what was ran on it, an audit, and actually see that, you know, it's time box access and easy to push through like a Slack channel as an integration. So a lot of these tools that are pre-built that, you know, doesn't require that my team's access whenever at the time. The other one that's interesting is agentless runtime scanner, and I call this one out because this is a recent one. This one's Wiz is a solution, but it basically when I talked about like Twistlock for container scans of the registry, you know, if it doesn't have a vulnerability in the time, CVEs, you know, evolve. You could run your scan of the registry, and then all of a sudden there's a vulnerability found, but it's already in production. And so, and if you don't change it, it'll sit there for a year. I mean, assuming you probably change it regularly, but so it would break in the build runtime or the CI process. But you should, you know, be aware that, you know, you could potentially have CV active in your environment that you're not scanning in your container. And so this one actually had an interesting one, a solution for doing cloud controls and scanning, where it actually takes the services that are running and scans that uses their engine to actually look at the volumes to see what's running on there, to see if there are any vulnerabilities on whatever interval you configure. So these are just a couple of them that I find that, if we would have stuck with the existing ones, maybe we wouldn't catch some of these issues in a more real time, and they could easily become a breach or an issue of concern. So I think staying ahead of what tools are out there, and they may not always fit, they may not always be cost effective, but just knowing that, and these will probably be the way that you'll see other ones evolve, and even the cloud providers will offer services. Or you might even be able to help, curate the roadmap of the features for these clouds by saying these things. So I think it's super important as a community to help with pushing these ideas. Spoiler, I think, like I said, meeting with these, I see a lot of abstraction around abstraction. I've seen, abstracted Terraform for IT users. So I think, being able to make it easier to work in cloud using another tool on top of Terraform. And some of it, I'm looking for the value in it, and I think it depends on the maturity of the team. But I think also we just have to be wary of, who's in control and the custom protections that are around it. I think that, giving, IT access or people that maybe are not as cloud savvy is good because it helps with the support side, but we just have to make sure that the controls are curated to what they can do and what they should be doing. Next one. Zero trust. I think there's a bit of a debate on some of the zero trust stuff. I mean, I think that it's easier for greenfield, and I think that brownfield can be really hard. So my only advice is to start to look at it. I haven't seen too many people going down this path yet, at least in the circles that I'm in. But I think the layer 7 and thinking more in a zero trust way is going to be the way forward. I think that, as we see more shared clusters supporting certain applications, and we've gone through the pendulum shift of going from huge accounts to micro accounts or subscriptions. And now it's, if you're running your AKS cluster, now we're looking at doing our own kind of shared clusters with divided namespaces. And so knowing where our micro segmentations are and depending more on access, as opposed to, a firewall being our protective guardrails for it, I think is important. I think that, we need to look at it also from, I'll talk about later, I guess in the deck, is the Cloud Connect. I mean, we have to think about from our DMZ perspective what that means if we're connecting into cloud, what the accesses are, the overhead on management of the firewalls whenever we're having applications or access in, because wherever you allow the potential bad actor in, then you've kind of allowed it in everywhere at that point. Cloud native, I talked a little bit about the appliances on-prem versus, making sure that, what you're running in cloud is the best fit for cloud. Like I said, we moved to the cloud native firewalls. And I think it gave us some more agility and the ability to velocity on our subscription model and be able to create more automation in order to accelerate, especially around different things around firewall rules and in areas where we have NSGs and different firewall groups and things like that. And just a recommendation is to, you're starting a new job, looking at your cloud, or just starting a new company is, maintain kind of a RACI on your least privilege around, different groups. I think it easily, you have kind of a leak of access pretty easily just because of a demand or what becomes important. And I think that, maintaining this as a reference model will keep teams honest. And I think where you allow your privileges is, you keep it to the least model, you'll know exactly where to look. Architecting from the back door, I think is my concept is just in general, from my experiences in cloud, I find that the cloud was pretty much created because when I look at it, working in a data center, it took, if you wanted a server, you had to budget for it a year in advance, and you had to actually have, probably 8 weeks to get whatever servers you wanted. And in the time in working in that space, we've reduced it. You start to commoditize it. You start to make it a, sample, like a single size, and maybe we pre-build. But I think that in general, the cloud has taught us is that people want things faster the way they want it. And so they'll game the system. They'll think around it. If I needed a server and it takes me 8 weeks and the budget ahead, I'm going to order 100 servers. I'm going to order 100 servers with everything they need, all the firewalls and the memory, and try to get it through, because I don't know where my, things are dynamic, things aren't static. In January, we have to think in an agile fashion instead of waterfall, and it might evolve in what my performance needs are. So I call that out because I think that we have to look at cloud and security in the fashion that things will change from what people have access to. Once somebody's in cloud, they can use whatever tech innovation or services. If you have hundreds of thousands of new services that are released from the cloud provider and they have an account there, they essentially can run those. In the old fashioned, in the old data center world, it was a lengthy paperwork process, and MSA, get a success criterion, a sales cycle, people bugging you whether you want it or not. I think in cloud, it helps with the agility to get there, but also we need to be mindful of the people that are making decisions and think about how to handle it best. I think, having security in the mindset or at the table whenever these discussions are made, or even just in tune. So they're aware of the audit trail of the services that are running in cloud. Access points. The other thing is the marketplace. Clouds have a marketplace option, private or public, and a lot of times they can curtail the actual legal paperwork or security reviews because it's just a click of a button and they're live with their services. So I've seen one where, like Mongo Atlas didn't have the right level of access controls from their SaaS platform, the integration into being able to control those at an abstracted level. And so, security was able to catch that and then, wait till these matured out, and then we could actually, and it was offered to an integration for federated access controls, then things could move forward. But in general, you could have people running these on their own. So you just have to be mindful. I recommend, having audits, being in touch with the services that are being released, and knowing your environment, knowing your developers, but also, developers, all the teams, SRE, anybody that you have, however you're structured with the potential coolest buzz team name, make sure that security is part of what they're thinking. Optics or illusions. I put this in here because these are kind of general questions that I think kind of come up, and we kind of talk about them, and I think that they stimulate debate. But I think, like, from Kubernetes, when I say K8s, what's your strategy? I think that we're in. I've gone to KubeCon. I've sent people there. In general, like, how are we managing our namespaces and the IP space around it, and are we thinking that way whenever we're looking at our cloud footprint? Like, you have AKS, ACS, all these different container services. We just need to know, are we doing a shared model? Are we doing a distributed model? And how are you managing your certs and your secrets, for that matter? There's things like HashiCorp and others that can help with dynamic secrets, but we just have to make sure that, however, this is part of the cycle. As people, we do application reviews of our applications, right? And so you can have an actual certified app. People are aware of it, the architecture diagram. The services might not change. The application might not change its functionality, but the infrastructure might change. And, this might not always trigger some new security review around it because everything is kind of staying the same. And so it's just super important to understand from an infrastructure what it looks like and what we're evolving to. And we'll see more from a Kubernetes, in my opinion, of where more applications are turning to. The cost advantages and the ability to scale and the potential reduction in support resources in time, I think are, what will catch the eye as more production workloads make its way into K8s. Immutable infrastructure. I think, I don't know how far people are along in their journey or if it's even a consideration. I think there's always that transient or ephemeral approach, or, immutable, and who has controls to it. And do you really need, admins if you're just going to shut it down? And I think there's just some thought that goes to it, and it goes back to kind of gaming the system when it comes, especially transient. I've seen, workloads where security tools are expensive, and so, but you pay per instance that's running, and it may take up resources. So if you have an AV scanner that needs to run and somebody's running T1 micros in AWS, they might complain if you have to put additional CPU contention possibility resources on it, and if they don't even have access. So I think it's just a shift in mentality of how they're managing your infrastructure, but be at the table and understand what the approach is and figure out what it means for admin access into this infrastructure and how we're able to control it. And in the maturation of observability and the monitoring, can you have everything through logging? Can you have everything through your tracing, and if you have APM installed, if you're leveraging that, do you have all the insights and you don't actually need to have anyone physically log in, you're protecting yourself a bit more. Shotgunning it versus having multiple people on it trying to troubleshoot is a much better approach. If you can scale it out, self-heal it, things like that. RFPs, ISOs, I've gone to roundtables around different compliance certs. I've been involved in trying to build out an ISO for a company. I think a couple things to call out there. One is that it's being involved in a lot of RFPs that for clients that come in, a lot of times it's commercial teams that come to tech teams with this, and they say, here's our CSA questionnaire, here's our, the company, this is kind of the answers we want to see in order to get the business. But a lot of times the things we lean on, they work, but it might not be for the right reasons. So if they ask if you have an ISO or SOC, and you're like, well, we run most of our infrastructure in AWS or Azure. Yeah, sure we do. Here's the copy of it. Now, is it hybrid? Do you have some on-prem? Do you have it for your data center provider? Is your application at the application level, your platform, is it completely certified? The questions, without doing those kind of questionnaires, and I've done them, people need to look through it kind of end to end to understand the security model and how they're, the thought process that goes into it. I mean, I recommend, I wish, any job I started now realizing it, but that I basically started that in the process, because I think that, at least ask if there's one present and read through it and see if it's static, see if it's updated. Because a lot of these questions will kind of come up, especially in the particular role that I'm in of managing a cloud platform. And also in a startup realm, I think that, if you're doing a startup, it's much easier to do day one, quote unquote, greenfield, as opposed to going back and retrofitting policies just for the sake of having policies, just so you can pass a SOC. I think it's good to embed those and think of it in that light and see what makes sense. So I wonder in time if some of these will evolve. I've seen some RFPs where in the contract or even the MSA that they try to put in penalties for unresolved CVs versus annual pen tests. Now, how many times have companies come back and actually used the pen test in my experience and said, hey, we need it annually, or we're cutting our business? Not often. I think it's a nice out if they, they're not happy with the services. But I think that maybe these things could evolve to, maybe this is kind of a call out to new startups to think of a way they could do it in a less cumbersome process, or a way to make it some way, scan it or build it from the start and make it easier for developers. I've seen somebody build an open source where you can do a lot of the policy curating in a certain format, which is kind of neat. But I think there's just general questions that I think come up. And is it just these as more of, like RFPs or in some of these certifications are, people can say, yes, I have all these tools, check. Does it really mean I'm more secure? And it may make the client feel, more secure, but are you using them right? It's kind of like if you said that on your local desktop, you're running stuff, that you have AV, you have all the security software to protect it, but you give the user local admin rights. I mean, they can change it. I mean, so it just depends on whether, I would say that you should look at these policies from the start and make sure that you understand where the potential gaps are, and then work towards it as your company is growing. Security costs, I mentioned egress earlier, so I'll call that out now, is that, that's where a lot of the cost is driven just in cloud in general. I think I look at all the services, and the services will change in price. I've seen AWS S3 drop in price. I've seen, RI levers to be able to reduce your cost. I've even seen tools do arbitrages on marketplace RIs, and it helps you. But I think from a network perspective, you're bound by the carriers that these run on. And I think that I haven't seen any price changes that I recall. And so a lot of the security tools that I see, whether it's firewall, API, WAF, it's all based on the amount of traffic. So sometimes if you have a high throughput of traffic, sometimes these tools are not cost effective in what you're trying to do. And so you just have to think of it, be mindful of what those could be as you're presenting these ideas to protect it with cloud native solutions, but also look out there, because you can't be facing the same problem by yourself. There's other ones who will be looking at it, and you have to understand the costs. And a lot of times there's opportunities for additional enterprise discounts, EDPs, things that can be negotiated depending on their volume. That I mean, in my opinion, I found out. I think that in general, that you will see more of a GitOps model in the future. I think more self-service. You have people doing and people thinking about it, but the more they're driving towards self-service to actually push for the ability to commit and deploy instantaneously. And this goes back to the latency. You know, people don't want to wait for things. And if they do, then they're going to essentially find a way around it. I mean, if there's any type of loophole where they'll ask for more, or they figure out what works. So I think enabling self-service will be a general direction we'll see more of in the future. And just be mindful of the egress stuff and latency sensitive workloads. You know, where you're using Kafka or other message bus solutions, event bus solutions versus high volume. And I've worked in the media inside of it where, you know, that's what we needed to do. Everything was real time and super sensitive, and also in a high volume on the kind of CPG retailer. And so you're delivering on a weekly basis massive data sets globally. And I think just making sure that your platform is secure, but you're also mindful of the amount of data, and making sure that whenever architects are involved in looking at solutions, that WAF has to be considered. I mean, you have to consider how you're delivering files. The tools that go in place is beyond just, you know, a simple architect team just trying to cover a particular functionality. It has to be secure. The TLS version that's going in. I mean, these are all things that sometimes I feel like are missed, and it just should be, you know, at the table from the start. Multi-cloud as well. Obviously, it picks up steam. I think it's, you know, build agnostic and think multi-cloud, but just be mindful if we're talking SIEM, WAF, firewall, all these egress models. Are you maintaining your own SIEM and all that egress traffic? You know, what's that look like? What's that look like if you know your business grows? And so I think, you know, the cost, I called it out in the beginning, is I think that, you know, leadership makes calls a lot on cost, but don't ever be shy about the security lever to be able to say, you know, there's a potential, and this is the potential for the risk that we have here if we don't plug this hole, or if we don't have this solution. I think it's important to bring it up at the start and try to build it in, or figure out what costs, you know, you can cut to make room for it. I think that making it more secure and building it in a future-proof way is the best. I think that, you know, certs, DNS, all these things that, you know, maybe had a traditional way in the past, I think in cloud, they're more centralized and sometimes cloud native, and enables access for the developers as opposed to a centralized team to manage these things. And so you just need to make sure that whenever you're building your guardrails, so I've been a part of projects where we've had guardrails in GCP, Azure, and AWS. And it's like a full-time job to maintain, you know, what new services are coming out, what we want to throw protections in for. And some of it might be beyond security and just cost or stability. We don't want them using a certain service. It needs to be proved out. And so the guardrails are great. I mean, it depends on the methodology. I mean, you don't want to confuse your end users or your consumers of cloud, but you also want to build it as fast as possible so they can get access to their kind of sub-subscription or sandbox. And I always recommend thinking in a whitelist, blacklist model. So, you know, production whitelist, and then potentially from a developed environment, blacklist things that you don't want them particularly testing. So just to recap, you know, go whenever you start a new job or whenever you're building a new company or where you are on your journey, I think it's important to kind of go through those compliance certs. Understand what people put in for those answers. Understand what the stance is. It's the same thing with RTO, RPO, BCP strategy, but I think security, sometimes you need to make sure that you are aware and you can answer these questions. And as you learn, maybe there's things that you can make a better process or improve, so you understand the posture and the stance there. I think at a 10x model, and I think this goes across to everything, and that 10x is important. You need to think about, you know, what if you get 10x number of clients, 10x number of traffic, 10x everything related to the platform that's existing, or the 10x number of applications. What's the implications there in security, and is that considered whenever you are growing? And draw KPIs around it whenever you are growing. And it's a good thing, it's a good problem to have, but just make sure if egress is too cost prohibitive at the moment, and there's a chance that things could grow at that direction, at least you have alerts in place to be able to start thinking of a new solution. Start thinking of it in that manner and be at the table and be present whenever the platform is being developed. But also embed it into those architects' minds as part, whether it's a council, a guild, be there. Think agnostically. Think from a open source, or maybe not open source, but think of it in a way that you need to be portable. Tech agnostic, maybe not a cloud agnostic, because, you know, you don't, a lot of the services you essentially, you know, whether it's a function in one, it's a Lambda in the other, but the underlying code can easily be ported over for serverless stuff. But make sure that whenever you're building it away from lock-in. So you have the capability to think from a guardrails perspective around protecting these services that are running, that you can build it and make it more abstracted away, and you can actually enforce these as guardrails on your cloud environment. I talked about this earlier, is that, you know, assume to assess all the tools that you have on an annual basis. And assume whether it's a light assessment, a big assessment, you might find that you found that you could save 50% of money and it's more secure. Maybe, you know, looking at it gives you some competitive advantage with your existing tool that you have. You could go back and forth and continue to create some sort of competitive pricing annually and get the same services or more. I think it's just important to understand the ecosystem and just be aware, because you could also stay on the same solution forever. Revolutions start with latency. And this is where I begin with the cloud. That's where I believe cloud started, was somebody sitting there waiting to get access to a server and didn't want to wait 8 weeks or a year. And this enabled it. It was a gateway that you could run up 100 servers and didn't have to tell people your exact budget. And all of a sudden, you know, you're running in cloud. You don't have to, you have your own, you know, external access. You're not managing your own internal software repo with guardrails. And so you're able to maintain, you're able to, you know, let the developer do what he wants to do. But I think we under the security umbrella, need to make sure that we have the guardrails in place so that doesn't happen. But this is just one step in the revolution. I think that the more latency that is injected along the way, people are going to find other solutions around it, like the marketplace, using new technologies that are out there that may not be already offered from the start. I think that, you know, same thing with firewalls. I think, you know, moving to more of a self-service or GitOps model to changing the, you know, whether it's your policies to allow access or firewall rules, you know, I think we'll get people from, you know, leveraging what ports are potentially open, or how they're thinking about their K8s cluster and their namespaces, and where they're running their applications, where there's already access. And I think maybe most importantly is that I think that it's more than just a frame of mind when we think of security, especially in cloud. Because these accesses are available, it needs to be at every level. We need to think of it for all the teams, whether it's SRE, DevOps, NoOps, GitOps, whatever the coolest name is it's coming out these days. They just need to make sure that it's a part of the process and what they're thinking, and making sure that the environment is, you know, as secure as possible. And they're thinking of it as the architect whenever they're looking at the solution, and calling out anything in question, and thinking about the tools to build with how to integrate as new things come out there. And I think if you do all those things, I think you're in a pretty good place for a cloud and managing it from a security perspective. Assuming you have the guardrails, we've gone down a path of like a vending machine style, where we're still working on some of the automation around, you know, IPAM or DDI to be able to auto allocate blocks and be able to get people their sandbox subscriptions. I've seen companies that would essentially, whenever you start, you get your own sandbox AWS account. It's a limited budget, but at least you can experiment. So I don't think we should slow down developers, but I think we should make sure that we have all the things in place, and we're thinking maybe one step ahead of them in order to kind of protect and embed the security, so they're not going too fast and we're playing catch up. And so, yeah, so thanks. If there's any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I do some of these presentations, I try to incorporate because the kids are home. So this is them sleeping. I think this was like the week before the pandemic shut down. And then I added like Marvel, because they're really into Marvel. So I added those throughout the deck just as something that kept them entertained as I was working on it. I don't know if you guys noticed, but cool. Well, thank you.
Hey, Brent, we do have a question.
Let me know if you guys have any questions, feel free. I think if there's anything in the chat, I'll take a look at now. Immutable infrastructure is adequate for storage, forensically sound data under legal hold. How can you be assured that data hasn't changed required in court? That's a very good question. I mean, I think that it depends on how you structure your immutable infrastructure and how the data is getting there. It depends on your pipeline and the type of data that's there. A lot of times when I'm looking at pipelines, you're using your S3 buckets or your data lake as a repository for the data. So your raw data is stored, in a central place. And this is a place that can be archived, encrypted, however we're going to store it at rest. And then whenever it's being processed or transformed, then this is where, you know, it's beyond, you have your still raw data that came in. And so you can protect that under a particular legal hold. For the, immutable, if you're sending it right to a server, it has to be looked at from an application perspective. I think if it's immutable and, you know, there's malicious stuff going on, there's storage that's isolated, there has to be some level of admin access to it. If this is the only place that the entry point is in. So I think there has to be some thought around it based on the application structure. But I think what I've seen in different patterns is you have, you know, potentially a data lake, or and you're using EMR or some Spark process, or you know, Kafka. You can put controls there and have replicas, and you're maintaining your playback there. It just depends on your structure and figure out what, you know, what the implications would be. So we'd have to, you know, look at it. If you have, I'm happy to kind of take a look at it, whatever the structure is, if this is more of a specialized question or if it's more generic. Any more questions or thoughts?
I wanted to call out that just as a reminder, we are doing some free rewards for questions, and that is in reference to our giving out coffee. So that will be a raffle that will be selected, and we'll reach out to you to get some information on how to send the coffee. So with that said, it's really to encourage you guys to be part of this and ask questions. So one last call for any questions before we close out this session. All right, I don't hear any other questions or see any other questions, so great. Brent, thank you so much for participating. I really appreciate it. As part of the CSA and Tampa Bay, the Tampa Bay B-Sides event, we definitely thank you for your time.
Excellent. No, I appreciate it. Thanks for the invite to be here. You know, welcome it in the future for future opportunities, and always game for questions and good security and tech talk. So feel free to reach out, anybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right.